Welcome to the Deploy Docker Containers to Azure App Services web apps. So in this lab, we're going to show you how to use CI/CD pipelines in Azure DevOps to interact with Docker containers. The starting point is using a build pipeline where we're going to grab some sample application code from our eShop on Web repo and turning that into a Docker container, which we're going to upload into an Azure Container Registry in the Azure subscription. And then in the second part of the lab, you're going to go through deploying an Azure Web App service, and then within spinning up a Docker container based application, pulling in the container image from the container registry. Now, depending a bit on the lab setup you have, the scenario might be slightly different. So I'm going to highlight some of the lab prerequisites we typically recommend, but again, it might be slightly different depending on your setup. So the first step is obviously connecting to your DevOps organization and creating a new project where in our scenario, it's called eShop on Web. Next to that, you also need to import the eShop repository from GitHub into your new eShop on Web DevOps project. So that's exactly what I'm showing you here. Last, as a lab prerequisite, you also need to create a service connection, which allows you to interact with your Azure subscriptions in the backend. If you should need any guidance on how to do this, go to the lab prerequisite steps on the GitHub repo for the AZ400 lab environment. So with all the prerequisites already done, we can move on with the first exercise. So what we're going to do here is importing a sample pipeline and configuring our CI, so continuous integration for Docker. So to do that, we go into pipelines and we're going to create a new pipeline, which we point to our Azure repos. We only have one repo called eShop on Web, and it's going to show me a list of options to choose from. Again, since we already have a sample pipeline in place, we can use existing Azure pipelines, and from the list of pipelines that we already do have available, I'm going to use the eShop on Web CI Docker YAML file. This is giving us a YAML pipeline definition where we might need to make some modifications, again, depending on your lab setup. What I did here is adding a few variables for my setup. I'm pointing to my Azure service connection. I'm using the subscription ID, and I'm using a specific resource group and location. If you're wondering where to find all that information, you can go to your Azure subscription, where I pre-created an AZ400 Docker RG, but you can choose that naming, or again, it might be slightly different depending on the lab hosting environment you're using. And if you need to find your subscription ID, you browse to the subscription topic and you're going to grab the subscription ID from here. Now, although we're actually running CI, it means there is no real Azure integration. But in this time, what we're doing is actually compiling a Docker container. And as you can see here, we're actually deploying it to our Azure environment. So that's why, although in the build stage, we already need that integration with our Azure subscription. Now, to walk you a bit through the details of the YAML pipeline, so we have the resources section where we define, for example, what repository we're using. We're defining a trigger, in this case none, which means it's relying on you manually pushing the pipeline run button. Variables already mentioned. And next to that, we do have a build stage, which is typically for a CI related pipeline. We're connecting to an Ubuntu latest Azure DevOps agent, and from there we're going to run a few different tasks. The Azure Resource Manager template deployment that you can see over here is the first step where it's actually deploying an Azure Container Registry using a bicep file. And the bicep file is part of our repository inside the subfolder infra, where we have a little bicep Azure template definition file called ACR. A little bit later on, we run a PowerShell script. That's where we're going to retrieve the ACR login server, like the credentials, you could say. And then next we have the actual build Docker image task. That's where you're going to run the actual Docker integration, where it's using the Docker file as explained during the class presentation. And we're going to create an image name where we're going to use the unique build run ID from the pipeline run itself. And then last, in the push the Docker images task, we're going to grab that build container from the local DevOps agent and pushing it, uploading it if you want, into our Azure Container Registry. So without doing much else, we're going to run the pipeline. Where after only a few seconds, it's connecting to an available DevOps server agent, and it's nicely looping through the different steps in our pipeline tasks. So if we take a look at the different steps and the different tasks actually inside our build pipeline, the first step is deploy ACR using bicep. Now what you can see here is only the starting point, where it starts with connecting to your Azure subscription. So that's where it's using the service principal, but we defined our connection using the recommended workload identity. But think of this as the permissions that you, or the credentials that you're gonna hand over to this specific pipeline run, allowing it to connect to the Azure backend. Next to that, it's running, as you can see down here, it's running template deployment. Now within the monitoring pane or the logging pane that you see here, it's not showing a lot of details from the actual Azure template deployment. If you want to see any of the details, like what are all the steps actually happening, you would need to go to the resource group and selecting the deployment settings there. Our deployment is complete, and you can see here that we're actually asking for some output information, because that's what we're going to use later on. It's also what we have in our next task. It's parsing bicep output, so just grabbing the ACR login server. And then obviously the biggest task is creating the actual Docker container image. So what it's doing here is relying on that Docker file, like the setup script, you could say, on how to compile the Docker container image, and it's looping through the different phases in there. So it's grabbing source files, it's copying the source code, and then like any compile scenario, it's running the from image, grabbing the baseline ASP.NET Web Application container image. A little bit later on, it's injecting the SDK for .NET 8 layer inside the same Docker image. Moving on, it's copying the source files over here in the build steps 2 all the way to 5. And then last, running .NET restore, .NET publish, and eventually creating our Docker image. Once the Docker image step is successfully complete, that's where it's now pushing the Docker images into the container registry. So pretty straightforward, I would say, running the different steps out of the YAML pipeline and interacting Docker file, running it against the DevOps build agent, compiling the Docker image, and last uploading it into the container registry. So with that, we're going to move on and working on exercise 2, where we're now importing and running the CD part of the pipeline. So we're back into pipelines and we're going to create a new pipeline, selecting Azure repos again, selecting the repo, using existing pipeline as an example, where this time we're using eShop Web CD Web App Docker. So again, what we're trying to achieve here with this continuous deployment is now actually spinning up the web application using the Docker image from that container registry that we deployed and pushed an image to in the previous CI step. So walking you through the details of the pipeline, same as before, we define a number of variables, my service connection from DevOps into the Azure subscription, the subscription ID, my resource group, and the location where I want to deploy my actual resources, in this case, the web app. We already had the build stage, which means that now we're focusing on deploy stage, where we have, again, 2 different steps. Step number 1 is running an Azure Resource Manager template deployment, about the same as what we did before, but this time we're using webapp.docker.bicep. It's basically the ARM template or the Azure template step using bicep language, which is creating the initial app service plan and the Azure app service itself. And then next to that, we also define role-based assignment. What we're doing here is actually creating managed identity for the web app and defining permissions that the app service resource, the managed identity, has the correct permissions to connect to the Azure Container Registry. Because obviously the registry is protected, which means you need specific RBAC permissions to open up that communication. From here, I'm going to run the pipeline. While it's getting queued, allow me to show you a little bit of the bicep files. So we had the content in the infra where we have ACR bicep. And as you can see here, it's a little bicep file where we're connecting to the resource group, defining the location from the variables in the YAML pipeline. And the biggest section here is creating a resource called Microsoft Container Registry, where it's picking up the location and some of the other settings. And then we also had our web app Docker bicep. Looks maybe a little bit more complex, but in short, we're doing about the same. We're connecting to the resource group, the location. We're connecting to our previously created container registry. And now we're adding 2 additional resources, the server farm resource type, which means an app service plan. And next to that, we're defining the actual details of the web app, including some specific application settings, like the memory for the database, the ASP.NET framework, which means now we're using Docker, and the publishing port of the image, which points to port 80. And then here we're specifying connect to Docker using the Azure Container Registry login server from the previous steps in the pipeline, and pick up the eShop on Web latest version of our image, which allows us to simulate like a full CI/CD and always publishing the latest version of the web app. If we check back in our pipelines, you can see now that our pipeline is already complete. Now, one of the options we have here is it's using that unique pipeline build ID. I'll show you that in a second, where that could become relevant. And then also later on, showing you how to make your naming a little bit more friendly. With all that, we are now back in our Azure subscription. We navigate to our resource group and we have our 3 different resources. So the first one here got created, container registry, out of the CI task in the build pipeline. And then next we created the web app and the app service plan. And within the web app itself, if we navigate to environment variables, you can see that the settings are nicely populated out of that YAML file. Navigating to our container registry, opening up the repositories, you can see that we do have one repository called eShop on web, and within we have different versions. So we have the latest, and for each and every unique build ID, like every single time we run the pipeline, it's going to create a unique tag for that specific container image. Remember, we specified to pick up the latest version of the Docker container image, which now means if I navigate to my web application, we can see that our eShop on web retail web application is nicely up and running. This completes all the steps in our lab where we showed you how to use Docker CI integration pipeline, CD pipeline to actually reuse the Docker image from the container registry and publishing it inside an Azure application web app service.